Alright, so this one is going to be an interesting video, because in today's Warframe guide, we're going to look at all currently available Helminth abilities in the game, put them in a tier list and rank them best to worst, so that you exactly know which of those bad boys is worth your precious resources and which ones to better keep on the shelf. As always, big shoutouts to all my generous channel members who help me keep the lights on, and now, let's jump right into it. Now, before we jump into the first skill, and this is very important, please don't skip this portion, I want to take a second to talk about how exactly I personally rank those and what every single tier means. Let's quickly go over it. S tier is pretty obvious, you know, the creme de la creme, the best of the best skills in the game. They're just so incredibly good and go onto pretty much any Warframe. Then in A tier, we also have great skills, however, they're not as good to qualify for S tier, but they're still extremely solid, very versatile, and you should definitely have them on the radar. As for B tier, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. See, how I define B tier is, those skills are actually good, in some instances even great, however, they're relatively niche and specialized, meaning that on some specific builds, they're great, maybe even absolutely mandatory, but if you're not going for those setups, you're probably not going to use them. C tier though is where it gets a little bit controversial. The way I'm going to handle it today is, in C tier, these are going to be the skills that are not necessarily bad, however they're outclassed by other available Helminth skills, which kind of do the same thing, just they do it better. And finally, in D tier, I'm going to put all the skills that are just not worth using, either because they're just objectively terrible, or because they get outclassed so hard by other mods, abilities, or whatever, that I can simply not think of any scenario where you would ever want to use them. But in any case, please remember that any tier list is always subjective to some degree, and if you feel differently about certain skills, that's completely fine. Feel free to let me know in the comments down below. But with that being said, let's finally jump into the first skills. Okay, so the first skills. Believe it or not, we actually have an order. We're not going to go alphabetical, but we're going to go by topics, and the first group of skills that I want to take a look at are the Helminth exclusive ones, those that don't come from Warframes, but from the Helminth itself, starting out with Empower. Empower is really simple. It gives your next ability cast more ability strength at the cost of a little bit of energy. Now, in and of itself, this doesn't really sound bad, you know, getting even more ability strength can be useful in some situations, but I honestly cannot think of a single scenario where my Helminth slot, the thing that is most valuable about every Warframe build, where I would burn that just to get the occasional boost in ability strength. So correct me if I'm wrong, but in my opinion, I'm gonna have to put Empower into D tier for I don't see why it would ever be useful. Next, Infested Mobility. This one gave me kind of a bit of trouble because it's so subjective. Mobility in and of itself in Warframe isn't really meta. It doesn't help you to kill enemies faster, it doesn't help with the objectives, it's purely about the fun of being a fast boy. And if you want that, then this is going to be a nice skill, but on the other hand, it's probably not going to help you with literally anything. However, since I'm aware that mobility is a really big thing in the community, I put this one in B tier for being niche, being specialized, but I can't justify going higher with this one. Master Summons. Oh boy. This one is really bad. Like, all it does is heal your companion and call it to your side. Remember, in order to heal your companion, you could simply use abilities. We have bond mods that reduce the respawn timer for our companions so hard that it basically doesn't matter if they die in the first place, so in my opinion, Master Summons is a relic of an era where companions could permanently die, and that would be sort of justifiable in that scenario, but nowadays, I'm gonna have to give this one D tier, very low D tier, please never use it. Rebuild shields does pretty much what the name says. You tap the button and then you regain your shields. Problem is, it has a 12-second cooldown, which means it's pretty much unusable in any high-level scenario, and not only that, we have other abilities that we're going to get to here in a minute, which also regenerate your shields and don't have a cooldown and are much more user-friendly, so this one for me is also a definite D tier. Don't see why you would ever use it. Okay, so Perspicacity, I hope I pronounced that right, is a very interesting one. Actually, I don't even want to put this in the tier list at all, because in my opinion, this is not a Warframe skill, this is an accessibility option. I think for 99% of the Warframe player base, hacking, no matter if it's a Corpus or a Grineer console, is absolutely no problem, and therefore you would never even think about burning a Helminth slot for an ability that helps with hacking. However, just because the overwhelming majority has no use for this, doesn't mean that it's completely obsolete. See, I know people always make fun of it in the comments when I mention this, but there are players out there who, for some reason or another, simply struggle hard with those timed hacking minigames. And no matter why that is, if you are one of those players, then Perspicacity is an amazing skill, right? It allows you to enjoy the rest of Warframe while not having to deal with that one single thing that you simply cannot do. So yeah, long story short, it's impossible to put an option setting onto a skill tier list, so I'm not going to do that, and simply say, if for whatever reason you struggle with hacking, use it. If not, don't use it, and let's go on to the next. Energized Munitions. Okay, this is really fun. I like this skill. What it does is, it gives you a chance of 75% whenever you consume ammo that you don't consume ammo, effectively quadrupling the magazine size of your current weapon. This is super fun when used on the right builds, especially those weapons which do a lot of damage but their magazine is like instantly empty. If you have such a weapon and combine it with a Warframe that gives you tons of fire rate, then put this one on it, bro, you're gonna like obliterate the entire room. It's super duper fun to play, but since it's still kind of a bit niche, I'm gonna put it into B tier, but definitely keep it on the radar. Next would be Marked for Death. This one is really interesting. You stun one specific enemy, and the damage that you deal to that enemy will be reflected outward in an AoE to all nearby enemies. So if you run a specific setup where you deal massive single target damage and you want to reflect that single target damage into the entire room, then Marked for Death is definitely worth considering. So we're also going to go and put this one into B tier for specialized skills. Expedite Suffering. This one is also pretty cool. It's kind of what Dante does with his ultimate ability and his slashes, just that you can put this one onto any Warframe. It takes all the bleed and toxin effects that are on a given enemy, and since these are damage over time effects, it takes all the damage that they have yet to suffer until the end of the duration and deals that damage in a single burst. I personally can't really think of a scenario where I would use this, but I also don't want to go and put it into D tier simply because I lack the experience, so I'm also going to put it into B tier for something relatively specialized, and I hope that maybe you in the comments down below can come up with some use cases where this is actually nice to confirm my suspicion. Parasitic Armor. Really simple skill. You lose all your shields and transfer them into armor for your Warframe, but I personally don't think that this skill is any relevant. See, over the last couple of weeks, I spent a lot of time investigating all types of tankiness in Warframe, and since especially armor has drastically diminishing returns, I don't think we should go and use our Helminth ability to give us more armor on top. On most Warframes, it's enough to go with one armor mod, and that's gonna be it. D tier for Parasitic Armor. Next one would be Hideous Resistance. Grant yourself immunity to the next couple status effects. This one for me is a definite C tier. There are other abilities from certain Warframes that can do the same thing to you, but they're not limited to just the status immunity. Meaning Hideous Resistance is not bad, but it gets outclassed, therefore I put it into C. Voracious Metastasis. I hope I pronounced that right. I think it's the first time I ever read this name, but trust me, I know Blackie knows what he's talking about, he knows. But yeah, this skill simply heals you and gives some energy to your allies. If you ask me, it is completely irrelevant because we have tons of ways to regenerate energy, regenerate health, we have multiple skills coming up that do the same thing for you and your team, and all those skills do it better than this one here. I'm gonna put it into D tier and say, probably you will never need it. Unlike Sickening Pulse though, which I think is very niche, but I can imagine it being also sexy given the right circumstances. What it does is, it creates a big AoE in which all the status effects that are affecting the enemies will be multiplied to the maximum amount of stack numbers that those effects can have. The exception here would be damage over time effects. Those just get their timer refreshed and a +1. But where I personally see this one being pretty useful is, for example, if you play Saren, right? You use her 4th ability to viral the entire room, and then you would use Sickening Pulse, where all the enemies that now have 1 viral stack onto them all of a sudden have 10, and that makes them so much more susceptible to damage. So even though it's pretty niche, I would say, I think it has a place. Therefore, I put it in B tier. And finally, the last one of the Helminth exclusive skills would be Golden Instinct, which is also pretty unrankable because it's not a combat skill. This one shows you a path to nearby valuable hidden items on the map. For example, as you probably know, Ayatant sculptures can spawn just as normal loot in the map, just we mostly don't see them, and this skill can lead you there. It also works on Void Plumes in the Zeraman 10-0 tileset, it works on Voka in the Entrati Lab tileset, so if you're searching for any of these things, Golden Instinct is gonna be golden for you, so I'm just gonna go ahead and put it into A tier, even though it's not really competing with all the combat-related abilities here. Alright. So much for the Helminth exclusive ones, and before we jump into the first Warframe skills, just a quick reminder, if you could leave a like that would be super awesome because it helps the channel big time with the algorithm, so cheers and 1,000 kisses so much for your generous support. And now, let's start looking at the Warframe abilities, where I personally want to start with those whose main purpose it is to just deal damage. Number 1 on this list would be Smite from Oberon. What this one does is, you shoot out 1 particle to an enemy, and then this particle will split up and hit multiple enemies, dealing in total 35% of the maximum health of the first enemy to the other enemies. However, it's important to know that not every single one of these particles does 35%, but all together, so each individual one only deals a fraction, and that means that without serious buffing, those things fall off in terms of damage pretty quickly when you go to higher enemy levels. So yeah, all in all, Smite is just really an, in my opinion, inferior version of Wisp's Breach Surge, to which we of course also will get, but for Oberon, this means he goes into C tier. Up next, we have Revenant with his skill Reave. This one, I think, is severely underrated. What it does is very simple. You turn into a sort of cloud wall and dash forward, and every enemy you hit with this will lose a certain percentage of their maximum health. In my testing with Revenant, I found out that if you have 10 viral procs on the enemy, plus 300% ability strength, then this one can really one-shot every enemy, even if they have armor, regardless of their level, so I think it's actually pretty crazy if you build for it. In terms of where I rank it, I kinda don't dare to even say it, but I put it in A tier, and I will showcase more of this build in my next Revenant video, so be tuned for that. Another great A tier skill in my opinion would be Hydroid's Tempest Barrage. This one, since the Hydroid rework, is a super strong skill. It creates a relatively small rain field where the raindrops that come down stagger enemies, they force proc corrosive and deal a lot of damage, and it even has an augment with which you can add viral damage on top into that mix. Now, the downside of this is, of course, the fact that the AoE of this is pretty small and you cannot increase it, but on Warframes that have, for example, a grouping ability, this doesn't really matter. You know, you can just group them up and then let it rain on top of them. And also in defense-type missions in closed-off tilesets, it's nice to lock down rooms where you can just go and put one of these rain fields into every entrance door, and because of the fact that it force staggers enemies whenever they get into it, no enemy can enter the room. All in all, in my opinion, also good A tier skill here. Next, Dante with his skill Dark Verse. This one is pretty straightforward in the Helminth. It just deals slash damage in a cone in front of you to all the enemies. The damage in and of itself is not really bad, but on the other hand, it's really meant to be used with Dante's final verse to create that big room nuke AoE, and if you don't have that, then I kinda don't see why you would put it on any other frame, so I'm gonna put it into C for not really bad, but outclassed by other skills. But alright, now we come to a really good one, and that would be Thermal Sunder from Gauss. What this one does is it creates an AoE in which you can either deal heat damage to all surrounding enemies, or cold damage to all surrounding enemies, or both, which creates blast to all surrounding enemies and does even more damage. But this is not the only use of the skill. especially with the upcoming changes to cold status effects and enemy armor, dealing heat to the entire room to half the enemy armor will be very useful going forward, and also frozen enemies that take more crit damage, well, sign me up for that. And then, as if that's not enough, there's also an augment which gives you additional damage to your weapon when you use the skill, so in my opinion, there is no reason not to put Gauss's Thermal Sunder into S tier. It's amazing. And very much because of Gauss's Thermal Sunder, the next Warframe is in a tough spot, and that would be Ember with her Fire Blast. Fire Blast, just like Thermal Sunder, creates an AoE and deals heat damage. It does have 2 augments, but I personally think both augments are not really relevant in today's meta. So, to make it short and painless, I put Fire Blast into C tier for not necessarily being bad, but being outclassed, specifically by Thermal Sunder. And the final damage dealing ability on this tier list would be Yareli's Aquablades, which I also put into C tier because even though the damage is not really bad and you can certainly make use of them, if you wanted to have a Warframe ability that deals damage to the enemies, is your first thought really, oh, I gotta use Yareli's Aquablades? I don't think so. So yeah, Aquablades, an outclassed damage dealing ability, C tier for that, and the next group of skills that we're going to take a look at are those that don't deal the damage themselves, but give you and your allies damage buffs. Now, when we talk about buffing abilities in Warframe, then the first thing that naturally comes to mind would be Rhino's Roar. Roar is an amazing damage buff. It, at base, gives you 30% more damage, but this damage is not base damage, it's considered faction damage bonus and therefore double dips on damage over time effects, and as if that's not enough, the damage does not only apply to your weapons, it also applies to Warframe abilities, even companions, and other members of your squad. Overall, Rhino's Roar is probably the most universal damage buff that kinda works on everything. In my opinion, Roar is a crystal clear S tier. Another very popular damage buff would be Zaku's Zata's Whisper, which infuses your weapon with additional void damage that can also trigger the void status effect of creating a bubble around the enemy that attracts nearby projectiles, kinda like Mag's Magnetized Bubble, just on a bit of a lower scale. See, the thing with Zata's Whisper is I wasn't really sure whether I want to rank it in A tier or in S tier because it is a great ability and specifically on the right setup it's incredibly broken, but it's also not as universal as Rhino's Roar. Nonetheless, I was generous and put it into S tier, albeit let's say S-. Then we have Rhino's big contender, and that would be Mirage's Eclipse. See, the battle between Mirage's Eclipse and Rhino's Roar is pretty much as old as the Helminth itself. Both give you the exact same 30% damage bonus, however, the bonuses work different. Whereas Rhino's bonus counts as faction damage, Mirage's damage buff is its own beast and multiplicative to anything else. Now, I don't want to go all too deep on the math with this one. At the end of the day, Rhino's Roar in most cases is the better option. There are select few use cases where Mirage's Eclipse is like 10% better, but it's relatively specialized. So in terms of damage buffing, Eclipse is not really what you want to go for. However, Eclipse also has a different side where it gives you a layer of protection by reducing incoming damage, and this is actually the reason why Eclipse is so cool. See? Not too long ago, Eclipse was depending on your light level. You were standing in the light, you would get the damage bonus, you were standing in the shadow, you would get the damage reduction. And that was inconsistent and trash to say the least. Now though, the light level dependence is out and we can simply toggle which of the ones we want. This makes especially the damage reduction portion really great in Steel Path because with it, you can make pretty much any frame of your choice tanky enough to take on even the highest level enemies. That's why I chose to put Eclipse into S tier, not necessarily because of the damage bonus portion, but because of the protective layer. Next on the list would be Mesa with her Shooting Gallery. The damage bonus of Shooting Gallery in and of itself is pretty trash because it just gives you a bit of base damage bonus for pistols and it jumps between your allies. It's all in all not that good, but this skill has an augment called Muzzle Flash where nearby enemies get their weapons jammed, and this one is actually a super underrated and very, very good crowd control. I know most of you probably haven't tried it for themselves, but I would encourage you to do so. I like it and therefore I put Shooting Gallery in A, but because it's a good crowd control skill. Volt is next, with his ability Shock that deals a bit of electricity damage to nearby enemies, nothing special, but it has the Shock Trooper augment which infuses your weapon with additional electricity damage. It's definitely not terrible, but I don't really see a use for having added electricity damage on your weapon, and in terms of weapon damage buffing, Roar, Zata's Whisper, Eclipse, all that definitely works better, so Volt Shock is gonna go into C tier for being not bad, but also not good. But let's go from guns into melee with Kullervo's Wrathful Advance. Yes, I know it's technically not a damage buff, but it gives you crazy amounts of crit chance, basically turning any melee into a red critter, and that is great. No matter which melee setup you play, Kullervo's Wrathful Advance is probably going to be your Helminth skill of choice, therefore I'm pretty much forced to put it into S tier, of course. And finally, for the offensive buff portion, let's also take a look at Volcure with her Warcry. This one increases your melee attack speed while decreasing the speed of nearby enemies. It is really not that great, especially knowing that we have Kullervo's Wrathful Advance that will probably be the #1 choice for any melee build out there. Warcry is gonna go into C tier. So much for the damage buffing group, definitely quite some nice skills in there, though the next group we're going to take a look at is pretty small, only containing 2 skills, and that would be those that increase your shields. First and foremost, we would have Hero with his skill Condemn, which is a straightforward ability. You shoot out a sort of wave of chains, and every enemy that gets affected by it will be stunned in place and at the same time refill quite a decent chunk of your shields. This, in my opinion, is a really great ability, because it's cheap to cast, you can spam it, it's a one-hand cast as well, so you're not locked into any weird animation shenanigans, and therefore it's great, especially for shield gating setups in very high-level content, where you don't really have the time to sit down and wait for your shields to regenerate, but you need them now, and you need a lot. In terms of ranking, I'm a bit unsure because I know I'm kind of biased towards it. I personally like it so much I would put it in S tier, but I know most people don't really use it all that much, so let's just say I go with the common sense and put it into A, but I think you should definitely look into it and keep it in mind. As for the second shield skill, of course, the Shield Queen herself comes around the corner, Hildryn with her Pillage. What Pillage does is, it sends out an AoE, and enemies that get affected by this AoE energy wave lose parts of their armor or their shields, depending on what of these things they have, and that is being consumed by you and turned into shields for your Warframe. Pillage is amazing. First and foremost, it can get you a lot of shields and additional overshields, and at the same time, with enough ability strength, you can full strip enemy armor in a big AoE, and also when you play against Corpus, get rid of their shields, so that's amazing. Really, the only downside that I see with this skill is that since this energy wave that it shoots out initially takes some time to expand and hit all the enemies, the shield refill for you is not going to be as instant as with Hero's Condemn, and therefore, especially in high-level shield gating content, it can be a little bit stressful to rely just on this skill. Nonetheless, of course, I see all the qualities that it provides, and therefore there's no way to not put Hildryn's Pillage into S tier. Good, so much for the admittedly short section on shield rebuilding skills, but they are definitely valuable. Up next, let's talk about some skills that... Thank you, neighbor. Thank you. Up next, let's talk about some skills that are incredibly valuable to pretty much every player out there, and that would be those that help you regenerate energy. Starting out with the GOAT, nope, not Oberon, the GOAT, greatest of all times, and that would be, of course, Grendel's Nourish. If you need energy, Nourish is pretty much the one to go for. It's in fact so powerful that the devs recently had to nerf it a bit because it was just overused that much. Regardless of the nerf though, Grendel's Nourish is still a definite S tier because what it pretty much does is, it gives you additional viral damage, which in and of itself is great, and it increases your energy gain from all sources. But just because Nourish is so good doesn't mean this is your one-stop shop. We also have skills like, for example, Citrine's Fractured Blast. What it does is, you shoot out a bunch of crystal shards, it's relatively cheap to cast, and enemies that are being hit by those have an increased chance of dropping health and energy orbs. The great thing about this is that with the mod equilibrium, health orbs equal energy orbs, and just in case you use something like health conversion to give yourself more armor, this of course also synergizes really nicely. In terms of ranking, I wouldn't necessarily say it's quite S tier, but it's definitely a strong A+. Just like the next skill, which would be Varuna's Lycath's Hunt. This one is pretty much exactly the same as Citrine's Blast, just with a different coat of paint. With Lycath's Hunt on, for every headshot kill that you get, the enemy has an increased chance of dropping an energy orb, and for every melee kill, the enemy has an increased chance of dropping a health orb. I think you know what I mean. It kinda is the same thing as Citrine's skill. However, they're both equally powerful, so just like Fracture Blast, we're also going to put Lycath's Hunt into A+ tier. Next, another female Warframe in the form of Gara. Now, in and of itself, Gara's skill Spectrage is not an energy regeneration skill. It's a mild crowd control that distracts enemies in its AoE, but it has an augment called Spectrosiphon, which makes that enemies killed in the AoE have a chance of dropping an energy orb. I'm gonna make this one short. It is a D tier. D because it's not only outclassed by pretty much any other energy regeneration skill, but also because, in my personal testing, it was really not good. And finally, we have Protea with her skill Dispensary. What it does is pretty simple. You drop down this dispensary and it shoots out both health and energy orbs as well as universal ammo, so it kind of supplies everything that you might need. In and of itself, this is really powerful, and that's also why I kind of think it's a controversial rating, but I'm still gonna put this one into C tier, because remember, my definition of C tier is skills that might not even be bad, but that are simply outclassed by other skills that do the same thing. And since we already talked about Grendel's Nourish, Citrine's Fracture Blast, and Varuna's Lycath's Hunt, which are all, in my opinion, better energy replenishments, I wouldn't necessarily put it on other frames. Okay, so let's go from the very important class of energy regeneration skills to another group of skills that are pretty good, and that would be grouping abilities. You know, pulling enemies together increases your kills per minute significantly, and we have quite some to choose from here. Now, first off, we have Gyre with her skill Coil Horizon. Throw a ball, and when that one explodes, it attracts enemies. I'm gonna make this one short. It goes into C tier because it is the worst grouping ability that the Helminth has, therefore you would probably never use it. Now, the next skills are very interesting, those being Mag's Pull as well as Korra's Ensnare. Let's go over both of them in one because they're kind of a yin and yang of grouping abilities. Mag's Pull is very straightforward. It's a cheap, fast to cast one-hand animation that pulls all the enemies together in front of you in one blob. The good thing is the ease of use, however the bad thing is that the enemies are being in a blob on the floor, meaning outside of melee builds, this is kind of a bit problematic because you're not really getting any headshots out of it. Then on the other side we have Ensnare, which is kind of the opposite. It has a bit of a delay, it takes some time to pull the enemies together, however they get stunned for longer and they're in a very nice position to give them tons of headshots. This one is your grouping ability if you want to go for guns. Now, first off, let's quickly rank them. Since I personally think that grouping abilities are incredibly important, I would go so far to put both of these in S tier. And now, let's talk about why I mentioned both of these together. The reason is the next one on the list, and that would be Nidus's Larva. In and of itself, this is a really good skill, there is no denying that. But I feel that it kind of combines the worst aspects of both Mag's Pull as well as Korra's Ensnare, and here's what I mean. See, the casting in and of itself is a bit clunkier than what Mag's Pull does. But the enemies caught in the Larva skill are also not really headshotable, so it has the clunkiness from Ensnare and also the disadvantage of enemy position from Mag's Pull. That's why I personally put it into C tier, but I'm also well aware of the fact that a lot of you out there really like this skill, and if you want to run with it, then absolutely go for it. Finally, that leaves us only with Zephyr's Airburst, which I put into B tier, even though the grouping is actually pretty bad. What the skill does is, you throw out a sort of air projectile, and on impact, it either pulls your enemies in or throws enemies away. This depends on whether you tap or hold the ability button on cast. Now, with the grouping being bad, it would actually go into C tier, however I put it into B tier because it has an augment that gives you some additional secondary weapon damage. So there might be some niche cases that I currently can't think of in which it could be nice, therefore I want to be generous, put it into B tier and move on. After we talked about skills that regenerate your energy and skills that regenerate your shields, naturally the next thing would be those that regenerate your health, the healing abilities. Let's talk about those now. First and foremost, we have Sevagoth's Gloom. This skill is incredible. It creates an AoE around you that also moves with you, and every enemy that gets into the AoE gets slowed so drastically that they're basically kind of frozen. And at the same time, when you deal damage to enemies, don't have to be in that AoE, they could be anywhere, you regain a portion of the damage that you dealt as health. This health regeneration is so strong that you can basically never die outside of the level ranges in which you simply get one shot, that is. Therefore, to make it short, Sevagoth's Gloom goes directly into S tier. Then, up next, we have the #1 quote-unquote healing frame in the game in the form of Trinity with her Well of Life. Well of Life was a very good skill when the game came out. However, the game has evolved and Well of Life simply didn't. What it does is you catch an enemy in a sort of force field, and if you or your allies shoot the enemy, a portion of the damage that you deal gets converted into health for you. So yeah, it's pretty much Sevagoth's Gloom, just stationary and without the slow, so it goes into C tier for being outclassed. Yes, I know, it does have an augment which has the possibility to give you a bit of energy at the same time, but you know, we have so many ways to regenerate energy in the game right now, I even made a full video about it, so I would say this does not save Well of Life. Then, to save some time, I'm gonna make the next one quick, that being Garuda's Blood Altar, that even though it is a good skill, you know, you see a pattern here, right? It falls in the same category as Trinity's. It simply gets outclassed by Sevagoth's Gloom, and I don't see why you would use Blood Altar over that one. Therefore, C tier we go. And finally, we have Seren with her skill Molt. Now, you might wonder, this is a skill to distract enemies, what does it have to do in the healing portion? The reason for that is the Restoring Molt augment, which makes it that every time you drop the decoy, you get quite the significant heal rate for a couple of seconds. The heal of this, in and of itself, is actually pretty decent. However, it comes at the cost of having an additional mod slot full with the augment, and also, now say it with me, it gets outclassed by Sevagoth's Gloom. So if you want to use it as a healing ability, it straight goes into C tier. However, this skill also has a second use, which makes it a bit more relevant, and that being as a shield gator, since if you tap the button, it has no casting animation, it happens instantly, and it is one of the best shield gating skills if you go with Brief Respite or the Augur mods, so therefore it does have some use in very high level content. I would put it into B tier. Alright, so many skills on the list already, and now I want to actually go into the biggest group of them all, and that would be crowd control abilities / those abilities that somehow do something with the enemy in some way. Starting out, this time alphabetically, with Ashe and his skill Shuriken. In and of itself, this thing is really not that amazing. You throw a couple shurikens, deal a bit of damage, nothing special. But it has an augment called Seeking Shuriken, with which it can reduce the armor of those enemies hit by the shuriken. This one is really not that good. Yes, it can fully strip armors, but it is relatively single target, and we do have abilities that can armor strip entire rooms, so why would you ever use this one? Next. Banshee with her skill Silence. This one is a very special skill. What it does is it creates an AoE around Banshee, and enemies that come into this AoE sort of get stunned in an animation, and only after that animation is over will they be able to go about their daily business again. The reason why this skill is so good is because it also works on acolytes that visit you in your Steel Path missions, and therefore it can stun them and give you the opportunity to kill them before they can negate your abilities. And this is exactly why I struggle so much to rank this, because if you play very high level Steel Path, long endurance, then those acolytes are a meaningful threat, and Banshee's Silence will help you big time with dealing with that. On the other hand, if you don't run endurance, or you're not even running into high-level Steel Path missions, it's just a crowd control, and Sevagoth's Gloom pretty much does the same thing, just it gives you heal at the same time, so you would never use it. At the end of the day, I decided to put it in both A and C tier. C tier for the lower level non-endurance player, and A tier for those that like to stay long on a mission and will be troubled by the regular acolyte visits. Choose which one of these applies to you. Next, Equinox, Rest, and Rage. In its day form, it makes enemies more susceptible to your damage, which is always great, and in its night form, it puts enemies to sleep. That means it's a great crowd control, it allows for stealth kills, you can use it to speed level weapons, and all in all, I will put it in a solid A tier. Just one thing to note here, if you play with Rest and Rage, you gotta also use the Common Frenzy Augment because this one spreads the effect to nearby enemies, making it much more comfortable to use. The reason I talked about Equinox so early is because of the next skill, which would be Lull by Baruch, and this is kind of the same thing like Equinox's night version. It puts enemies to sleep, and if you wake them up, they're sort of a bit confused. Yes, it's a nice crowd controlling ability, but then again on the other side, Rest and Rage from Equinox does the same thing and delivers more on top of that, so I put it into C tier for being outclassed. Up next, we have a relatively new frame, that being Daggeth with her skill Weird Sights. This is actually really good. It kinda looks like Aquablades from Yareli, which, as we all know, was not that good, but Daggeth's blades actually seek out nearby enemies, fly towards them, and not only deal quite the decent damage, but also apply a ton of viral to those enemies. If, for whatever reason, you cannot run a Panzerwelpe with your current loadout, then Weird Sights is definitely worth considering. I put it into A tier. Up next, we have our butt beauty Wisp with her skill Breach Surge. Breach Surge is a phenomenal skill. As you might remember, I was talking about it in the beginning of the video already. What it does is it sends out so-called Surge Sparks that hit enemies and blind them. When those enemies take damage, they have a chance to spawn another one of those Surge Sparks, and if they die, they are guaranteed to spawn one. These additional sparks are homing missiles that fly towards nearby other enemies and deal damage to them. And not just a flat amount or anything, they deal a multitude of the damage that killed the enemy before it. So whenever you run a setup that deals big time single target damage, Breach Surge can make an entire room clearance out of this. It is great, I put it in S tier, you should absolutely have it. One thing you probably don't want to have though is the next on the list, and that will be Excalibur's Radial Blind. As the name suggests, you press the button and then all the enemies around you that are looking into your direction are blinded. They are open to finishers and can't attack you until the blind is over, but the problem with this is, Breach Surge. It kinda does the same thing and it also deals much more damage. In my opinion, Excalibur's Radial Blind goes in the C tier for being outclassed. And now that we're already talking about blinding enemies, let's talk about Inaros and Desiccation. Desiccation is like Radial Blind, just not in an AoE, but only in a cone in front of you. You throw sand at the enemy, and if the enemy is looking at you, they get blinded, also open to finishers. Now, as I already put a Radial Blind into C tier, and that was a 360 AoE, of course Desiccation fares even worse than that, therefore I put it into D tier. Now, I know there's the augment, and with this augment you can theoretically spawn a sand cat, and that sand cat can spread the effect on nearby enemies, yada yada yada, but let's be real here. If you really want to go for this, you waste your Helminth ability plus 1 mod slot for the augment mod, just to create an occasional sand cat that will occasionally hit one enemy and spread an effect that is not all that good altogether. So even though I like my sandy boy as much as the next guy, I cannot help but put this one into D tier. Lavos is next, and Lavos' Helminth skill is Vile Rush. What this does is, you dash forward and in the process of doing so, throw out tons of vials that inflict cold status effects on nearby enemies that you're passing. As of right now, this skill is not all that amazing because, we have Thermal Sunder from Gauss, which can deal better AoE cold, but with cold being buffed in the near future, I kinda wanna give it a chance and put it into B tier because I think it might be able to deal more cold effects than Thermal Sunder in a faster period of time, and that could be occasionally useful. Next L frame would be Limbo, and Limbo's skill is Banish, which allows you to put an enemy or an ally into the rift, aka into the second dimension that Limbo sort of creates. This one really isn't useful except you're trying to troll your teammates. Yes, I know it has an augment with which you can heal the teammates, but on the other hand, there are like a gajillion other methods to heal your team, so into D tier, this one goes. Alright, now we come to Loki. And Loki is the stuff of my nightmares for the last couple nights since I was thinking of this video, because I have no idea how to rank Decoy. Decoy itself kinda is complete trash, right? There are better crowd control abilities, it can take next to no damage, and that's it. However, it recently received an augment mod that now allows it to deal multiple different status effects to enemies, which is not bad. And then I stumbled across a video from Nova Umbral where he went on a deep dive on what Loki's decoy can actually do and how it can break the enemy AI in crazy ways. And I don't want Nova Umbral to be mad at me for putting decoy in D tier, so I'm just gonna put it in B- and say it could theoretically do some niche things that are nice, and go on to the next frame as if nothing has happened. And this one is luckily pretty straightforward. It's Necros' Terrify that makes enemies in an AoE run away from you so they cannot attack you, and they get armor stripped at the same time. This, in my opinion, is the best armor stripping ability in the game right now, and at the same time it serves as a protective skill because enemies running away cannot attack you. It's great, I put it in S tier, and you should absolutely have it. Next, Nezha Firewalker. To be fair, I don't have that much experience with Nezha's Firewalker, at least not as a Helminth skill. On Nezha, it's good, you can use it. I personally would never consider using it as a Helminth skill, but I'm sure there are Nezha fans out there who have crazy builds where they use this and that are actually very potent, so I'm gonna sue for P tier, put it into B tier, and hope you can come up with scenarios where this is actually good to confirm that it deserves this tier. Next is Nova, and Nova is a clear no. Her skill is called Null Star, and what it does is it surrounds your Warframe with these little balls or spheres, and those give you damage reduction. The more of them you have, the more damage reduction you can get, up to a maximum of 90%. This sounds great if it wasn't for the fact that whenever an enemy comes near, one of those spheres is going to fly towards the enemy to deal minuscule amounts of damage, and therefore the amount of spheres that you have will constantly go down, constantly fluctuate, therefore your protection and your percentage of damage reduction is also going to fluctuate. And if there's one thing I don't like, then that is inconsistency, so Null Star is going to go into C tier because it gets outclassed by the defensive portion of Mirage's Eclipse that is more consistent. Next, we have Chirinka Pillar from Corvex. This one is great, right? You can put 2 of these pillars down, they have a great range, have a great duration, they put radiation on all the enemies in the entire room, forcing them to attack each other, so it's basically like a pocket Nyx for everybody to take home. I would rank this one A. And speaking of Nyx, Nyx's ability Mind Control selects one enemy that is then forced to attack other enemies. Well, we just talked about Chirinka Pillar doing that to the entire room, so this one clearly goes into D tier because it gets so heavily outclassed, we don't even need to talk about it. Another good crowd control would be Resonator from Octavia. You throw down a ball, the ball rolls around and attracts all the attention of nearby enemies. It's a solid crowd control, it gives you some breathing room, and therefore I put it into B tier because there are a couple of builds where this one is actually a good choice. Another good choice would be Styanax's Tharo Strike. This one kinda works like Necros' Terrify, but not in an AoE, just in a cone in front of you. You shoot out Styanax's shields, and if they hit an enemy, they armor strip the enemy, but they can also reduce shields. Now, I wouldn't go and also put this into S tier simply because it doesn't have the 360 AoE, but it's a definite A, and it's much faster and cheaper to cast than Necros' Terrify, so for any Warframe setup that likes to attack forward anyway, I would actually prefer this one over Terrify. Then we have Titania with her skill Spellbind. This one jams the weapons of enemies, and therefore it goes into C tier because, as we already established, we have Mesa's Shooting Gallery with the augment that does the same thing, but Mesa does it better, so there's no real use for this one. And finally in the crowd control tier, we would have Vauban with Tesla Nervos that I put into D tier because, you know, you shoot out a grenade, the grenade attaches to an enemy, it deals a bit of zap electric damage, minimal crowd control. Yes, it does apply electricity, but then again, why would you want to apply electricity? So yeah, I just don't see a use for this at this point in time. And now, before we wrap it up for today, let's also go over all the skills that I haven't mentioned so far that kinda don't fall into any of the aforementioned categories, starting out with Atlas and his Petrify, which is a very straightforward skill. You turn enemies into stone. In and of itself, this skill is complete trash, B tier, no further questions. However, it has an augment called Orgaze, and what this one does is, petrified enemies have a 25% chance on death to drop additional loot. This one is very great because it stacks with other looting abilities like from Necros, Korra, or Hydroid. Therefore, if you have a setup to farm resources, Petrify definitely has to be on it, therefore I put it in B tier. Next would be Caliban with Sentience Wrath, which is an ability that stuns enemies in an AoE and makes them more susceptible to damage. In and of itself, it's not a bad skill, but with so many crowd control and enemy debuffing abilities already in the game, yeah, C tier, it gets outclassed. There is not really a point in using it. Then there is Wukong's Defy, making you invincible for a short period of time, and after that you get a lot of armor. I'm gonna make this one quick. Just like Parasitic armor, we also gonna take this one and put it into D tier. Same story with Chroma's Elemental Ward. This ability does a ton of different things, however, I personally think none of them are really relevant. At least I cannot think of a scenario. Maybe you have a better idea, then let me know in the comments down below. I'm always open to cool ideas. But yeah, as it stands right now, Elemental Ward will go into D. Same story with Frost and his Ice Wave, because, you know, while it is nice to have some cold, especially under the premise that cold is being buffed very soon, we also have Thermal Sunder, and Thermal Sunder is a complete AoE, not just in a cone in front of you, qualifying it for nothing better than D. And last, and also kinda definitely least, would be Avara's Quiver, a skill that does a whole different things. I'm not gonna go through all of these right now, but yeah, it's very gimmicky and I also don't see why you would ever want to use it, therefore I put it into D as well. And if you now want to know about the best 10 Warframes to put all these abilities on, then this is where to go. Another big shout out to Niels V, Demon Loizel, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Lycan Shepherd, Turtlepeer, Shadow Soul, Pepperwolf, Ondakanio2, Misfire DX, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.